Hello, this video is for April the 10th. Once again, I just want to remind you to not pay attention to the lesson plan material that was given to you in the papers, just to pay attention to the video date and go by the video because, excuse me, I think there's a lot of confusion on that, and I'm getting the 3 points, but some of you are a few lessons ahead, some are a few behind, and I get it. Just try to stay with us. Okay? Today we're going to finish the section that we have been talking about, but we're going to be on page 316. And so go ahead and read that section if you haven't already, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Pause. All right, so before I go and talk about today's lesson, let's just review. Yesterday we talked about the different types of innovations during World War I, and one of the innovations was the plane, that, fighting in the air, and we had what you call dogfights with these airplanes, and we talked about the flying aces. If you were able to shoot down 5 or more planes, you were called a flying ace. I also mentioned about a German man who was called the Red Baron, and he shot over 80 people. I did put a link about his life in the 7th grade history section, and also I put the Snoopy song in the history section, so it's kind of like a fun little song, but it kind of talks a little bit about Baron von Richthofen, and so I thought that would be fun for you. So not only did they have planes, but they also had machine guns. Now the machine guns are different than what they have today. The machine guns, they didn't really carry and shoot like you see if you're playing Call of Duty or even war videos nowadays, or even war movies that you watch. But back then, the machine guns were propped up, and they could be propped up in the trenches or wherever they were hiding and be able to shoot, and they were able to kill more people with one round than they could before. So that's why there were so many more deaths during this war. So the machine guns, also we talked about poisonous gas, whether it be mustard gas or the Germans used this a lot to suffocate the people, and they would use chlorine, things that would burn the skin, burn the eyes, cause breathing problems, and so they wore these gas masks, which were kind of scary looking, but that was another thing that they used. Also, we talked about the Zeppelin. The Germans had the Zeppelin, and they were able to drop bombs on unsuspecting people, and the British had blimps, and these blimps, remember, they were able to see underwater, so they could detect a German U-boat or things that were in the water and could drop bombs there. So we also talked about the U-boat. That was another invention, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in this lesson. But I gave you the definition of total war, so I'm going to go ahead and read that definition again to get you more familiar with that. But total war is a war in which all the country's resources are devoted to destroying the enemy, war in which there are no limits on targets or the kind of weapons used. So it didn't matter if a person was a civilian or in the military or what, they would do whatever they had to do to win. And then we talked about civil religion. It was the use of religion to promote the goals of state. Because we talked about propaganda. Propaganda could be used for influencing people to you know, join the war, to do things for the military, or it could make propaganda could be used to make the enemy look bad, right? So we've talked about the course of the war. We've already talked about the initial movements, industrialism and innovation. We talked about propaganda and total war. So today, when we're going to finish this section, we're going to talk about the major turning points. Remember, a turning point is when things are going one way and then all of a sudden it just kind of turns around and it benefits another person. So it's like an about face. And I use that example, the Battle of Midway was a turning point of the war. Gettysburg was a turning point of the war for the North. The South was winning everything, and all of a sudden the Battle of Gettysburg, that was a turning point. It took the advantage the other way. So we have the major turning points. There's two major turning points that we're going to talk about. And also, World War I has so much information, but you guys are only in 7th grade, so we're not even going to touch everything that we could talk about with World War I. So if this interests you, or if World War II interests you, I encourage you to read books about it or watch YouTube videos on documentaries, because it's a really interesting war. This was called the Greatest Generation, the Great War. So, and then also the aftermath of the war, what happened, the cost of lives, the cost of, cost lots of money, okay? And then we're going to talk about the aftermath, which would be the Paris Peace Conference, okay? So last time we're going to talk about the guiding questions. We were talking about the major turning points of the war, which we are going to discuss today. We've already talked about the significance of nationalism, which is pride in your nation, and propaganda in the promotion of total war. We talked about, you know, the victory gardens and not eating meat on Wednesdays, or not using your gas, or working to send money to the military and the people overseas to have better food, okay? And then how did industrial production and innovation affect the tactics, scales, and duration of the war? We also talked about the tank, the British tank, and how powerful and mighty, and it was able to go over the trenches. It was kind of scary. It was a little bit different than what we had today. It moved a lot slower, at a slower pace, but it, you know, if you saw something like that coming towards you, it would be a scary thing. All right, so let's talk. We're gonna discuss Vladimir Lenin just briefly today, and then Vladimir Lenin, and then we're gonna talk more about him later on. Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. So one of the first turning points of the war was when Russia signs a peace treaty with Germany. Remember, Russia is on the side of the Allies, and they're going to end up pulling out and siding with Germany as far as signing a peace treaty. So, a long time ago, we learned about this dude, Nicholas II. Nicholas II in, I think it was chapter 16, all right? And he was the Tsar of Russia at this time. He ruled very cruelly. He was tough on his citizens, and also during this time, though, he took like a mini vacation. He was not there, and so there was a lot of instability in Russia. They didn't know what was going on with their government. People were confused, and so the citizens of Russia wanted something different. So Nicholas II, he steps down from the throne on March the 15th, 1917. He abdicates, and he decides that he doesn't want to be ruler anymore. So Vladimir Lenin steps in to take his place, okay? He's not really a czar, but he becomes the communist leader. So he came to power in the Russian Revolution and signed a treaty with Germans, taking Russia out of World War I. He was a communist. He was the first communist dictator of Russia, and he's not a nice guy. He's going to these people thought that Nicholas II was bad, and they, you know, wanted a new ruler, but it's going to be worse for them, all right? And so that was one of the turning points, taking Russia out of the war. So Russia's no longer helping England, and no longer helping, I forgot, France. And so they're out of the war, and that's going to affect a lot of people. Another major turning point of the war was when the United States enters the war. Now remember, the war started in 1914. Now it's 1917. The U.S. has managed to stay away and mind its own business. Now, what happened was Woodrow Wilson, here we go, and it's easy to remember World War I. He was the president during World War I. I always tell my students, remember Woodrow Wilson. And he was going to be reelected, and he went to be reelected on the theme, you know how Trump has, Make America Great Again. His theme was, keep America out of the war. That was his slogan. And he was able to win presidency with that slogan. His goal was to keep America out. However, some circumstances happened that's going to change America's point of view about the war. One of the reasons was unrestricted submarine warfare. Remember that the Germans had sent letters to America that said that they were putting their people at risk if they were to be on any British liner or just travel with the British. If they were in waters that they should not be in, that they had the potential of being shot, you know, through or sunk. And so Germans wanted to control the sea, and they were sinking British ships like crazy. A lot of things were happening. So that was one of the things that kind of bothered Americans. Hey, you don't own the sea. Americans can go ahead and travel, but that was one of the things that they were wanting to fight about. Well, remember the Lusitania, I think there might be a picture, but the Lusitania was a British luxury liner, kind of like, you know, when you go on a cruise ship, kind of like the Titanic, okay? This was a British liner, and they were traveling from Britain back to the States, and as they were traveling, a German U-boat sank it. Now, they shouldn't have. It wasn't a threat. These were just citizens. These were just innocent people taking a trip, okay? And so on that ship, there were over 100 Americans, and this angered the people of America. How dare these Germans do this to these innocent people? So that was one of the reasons that America was starting to get angry and antsy and saying, we need to do something about this. So that was the sinking of the Lusitania. But the thing that, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back was the Zimmermann telegram, okay? The Zimmermann telegram was from the Prime Minister of Germany, and his name was Arthur Zimmermann, and he sent a telegram to Mexico asking Mexico to help the Germans in the war, fight against the Americans, because they knew that if they were already mad at the Germans, so the Germans had a feeling that America was going to go to war on the side of the Allies. America was kind of powerful, so people were a little afraid of the Americans back then. Go on the side of the Allies. Therefore, they asked Mexico to start a war with America. So here you have Mexico's underneath the United States, and so if America was over here fighting, and then Mexico started fighting, America would have to do both ways. Kind of how I said Germany tried with the two-front war plan with fighting Paris and then fighting, turning around and fighting Russia, or trying to conquer Paris and France and turning around and fighting Russia. So they wanted to have Mexico join to fight the United States. Germany told the Mexicans that if you do this, we'll give you back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. This really, really angered the Americans. So the people requested, at the request of Woodrow Wilson, he went to Congress, because remember, a president can't declare war, Congress declare war. So he went to Congress and he requested that we go into war. So America enters the war on April 6th, 1917. April 6, 1917. And we declared war on Germany on that date. So John Pershing was the military commander during this time, and he commanded, for the Allied troops, he commanded over 500,000 men. Sometimes these people would lead, other, so the British soldiers or whatever. So he was the commander of the Allied army. America sent over 150,000 men, and they were asking for volunteers, 18 years and older, to volunteer. They trained these men really quickly and sent them on a ship to go fight the war. And on November 1918 is when everybody met at the Paris Peace Conference. Okay, so I know we're going through this really quickly, assuming that we've already fought and now it's over. And so many countries met during this conference, excluding Russia. They didn't invite Russia because Russia had already pulled out from the Allies, and all the countries that supported Germany or supported the Central Powers were not invited. So they came up with all these, the Paris Peace Conference. There was a conference after World War I where 5 treaties were formulated, including the Treaty of Versailles, which is the most important that we're going to talk about of all of them, okay? The Treaty of Versailles was between the Allies and Germans that had harsh demands and blamed Germany for World War I, of course. They blamed them for World War I. So one of the demands was that Germany had to decrease its army. They had to make it smaller. They set up new borders. So now we have all these countries that existed are no longer existing, and they're adding new countries like Czechoslovakia. Later it changes to the Czech Republic. But tearing down the Ottoman Empire and things like that, which is Turkey today. So they set the new boundaries, and they also said that Germany had to pay for the war, billions of dollars, okay? So it was very harsh for Germany, but they were punished for that. So the cost of the war. This war had such a great cost, and remember, with the new innovations with weaponry, it just made it so much worse. 10 million men died in battle. That's just in battle alone. And then 26 million were wounded or missing in action. So those 26 million that were wounded probably ended up dying from their wounds. That was a cost, and that's not just Americans, that's just everybody together. One of the things that happened also during this time, we learned the term genocide. Genocide is the deliberate killing of a large people group, especially those of a particular ethnic group. So one of the groups that was really targeted during this time was the Armenians. The Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire, and they were under control of the Ottoman Empire. Armenians were Orthodox Christians The Ottoman Turks, of course, were Muslims, and they felt threatened, kind of like Hitler did with the Jews. They felt threatened by these Armenians because the Armenians, there were so many that were living in Russia. And the people of the Ottoman Empire thought that if the Armenians got together, that they were going to turn against the people, the ones that were living in the Ottoman Empire, because they had family living in Russia, and there were so many in Russia. So they were afraid that Russia was going to get the Armenians to turn against the Central Powers. So they started killing them. Earlier too, so over 100,000 Armenians died in the first round of killing, and then another round in 1901 saw 30,000 more. They resorted to genocide. Genocide, like I said, is the killing of the race of people. Didn't matter, and it's just like, we're gonna wipe out the Armenian nation. When the war broke out, I already said that they thought more of an opportunity to kill them because they didn't want them to side with the Allies. One of the things, they would kill these Armenians. It didn't matter if you were a woman or a child. Sometimes they would shoot them, sometimes they bayoneted them with, a knife on their guns. They would burn them in their houses. They would, one thing it said, they would march the survivors over 200 miles to detention camps and over Syria and Palestine. They would kill some on the march, so if you were weak or if you fell, they would kill you. They would torture them. Some died of hunger, abuse, or disease. One example was that there was a journey of 18,000 Armenians, and when they finally arrived at the detention camp, there was only 150 left. So they believe that approximately 1.5 million Armenians died between 1915 and 1923. Sound familiar? Well, there was a man by the name of Adolf Hitler, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish authorities, denied that all this happened, just like people in Germany denied, and people today deny that the Holocaust actually happened, which to me is so sickening to do that. But Adolf Hitler is reported to have referred to the annihilation, there it goes, of the Armenians in a speech. So he had people at his house. This is a week before the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. In his speech, I'm just going to read this little excerpt, Hitler boldly proclaimed that the imminent war had its goal, the goal of the physical destruction of the enemy, okay? And explained the destruction including men, women, and children. So Hitler's plan, he's going to invade Poland, which is going to start World War II. But he's telling these people, it doesn't matter if you're men, if you're a man, if you're a woman, or if you're a child, we're going to kill you. We're going to get rid of everybody, the Polish people, okay? And Hitler justified his slaughter to gain the living space for the Germans. He said, well, we'll get rid of them, and now we're going to have more space, all right, that the Germans needed. He said, and this is what his quote, he said, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Basically, who talks about it? No one talks about it. So it doesn't matter. We can go ahead and do this. So he used this as an excuse to massacre the Poles, just as the Turks did, and bring it to World War I. That saying that he did with the Armenians, who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians, is inscribed on a plaque at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. to remind viewers or people that go there of what happened to the Armenians and also what happened to the Jews during World War II. All right, so, sorry, some review questions, and then we end this section. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the leaders. Actually, Monday we'll talk about the leaders of World War I. One of the review questions: who made the first military move in World War I? Germany. Okay, right. How did the Russians upset the Schieffelin Plan? They mobilized faster than the Schieffelin Plan had anticipated. You remember the Schieffelin Plan? Get France, then go and get Russia. What weapons did the Germans use to reduce the impact of British naval superiority? Which is the submarine or the U-boat. And then, what is total war? A war in which there are no limits on targets or the kinds of weapons used. What were two major turning points of World War I? Well, when Russia pulled out and when America joined, sending troops to France. And how did industrialism and innovation increase the death toll of World War I? Well, new weapons such as machine guns, flamethrowers, enabled horrific loss of life. Airplanes, Zeppelins were used to drop bombs on the enemy. And this is another thinking question. After 10 of millions of dead and wounded, many thought that World War I was the war to end all wars. But roughly 2 decades later, a second world war broke out. Why would such devastation not actually cause war to cease, as many thought? Well, first of all, we always try to have peace. And the only way we can have peace is through Jesus Christ. We live in a sinful world, and that's just what happened from the very beginning. And I'm going to read this verse to you, verses. In James 4, 1-3, it says, "From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence? Even of your lusts that war in your members? Ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts." You know, like I said, we live in a sinful world. War is never going to stop until one day when we get to heaven. But we need to do our part by, it takes one person to make a difference. And if you see someone being bullied or you see someone being treated poorly, take a stand, because if someone would have said something, I know they probably would have lost their lives, but taking a stand saying, no, this is wrong. If some of the German leaders would have said, this is wrong, I know they probably would have lost their lives, like I said. But knowing that you made the choice to do right. I know there were some German people that actually did right and hid people and tried to help. But that's just something that we need to remember, that unless it happens again, you know, we don't want that to happen again. We don't want genocide to happen again, whether it's for the African Americans or the Mexicans or the Asian people from China, Japan. We don't want to treat people horribly. And so that's just a lesson to learn today. Tomorrow or Monday, we will talk more about the leaders of World War I and gearing up towards World War II and the Depression, which is kind of sad too. I love you guys, and I hope you have a great weekend, a great Easter break, and thank God that He is risen, Jesus, and I hope you make good choices.